Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my hideout in Syria. But apparently, Gabriel is also coming to us from an undisclosed location in
Yeah.
front of a car.
Well, I mean, this is my revolutionary Islamist flag right here.
Yes,
You
yes,
thought it was a green screen, but you were mistaken. I,
yes. We're all getting radicalized these days by the internet.
the chair is just blocking the script that says "Death to all infidels," but starting with Pascal.
Yes, that's usually how it goes. Um, yeah. So, Gabriel, I wanted to have you on because you're one of the smartest people I know,
Oh,
one
thank
of
you.
the funniest people I know,
That's
and
flattering, given that I know you know some very smart and very funny people. So like a lot of people would be like, "Okay, who cares?" But
but by day you're a professor of sociology at UCLA. And sociology. So I come from France, which is the land of Auguste Comte and Émile Durkheim and Pierre Bourdieu. And so, if you ask
because
a
my
French
undergrads
person,
invariably call him Pierre Bordeaux, and I always have to tell them
Bourdieu,
Bordeaux is a wine, Bordeaux is a
yeah,
sociologist.
yes, Pierre Bordeaux. Um, And if you ask a French person about sociology, you're going to get either one or two answers, depending on whether your interlocutor is a Marxist or not, which is either sociology is this wonderful discipline which teaches us, which scientifically proves that rich people are evil and that the reason why some people have more money than others is because rich people are evil. Or if you're speaking to a non-Marxist, he will say, well, sociology is a bunch of claptrap funded by my tax monies to justify stealing my money.
Mhm.
So somewhat provocatively, I told you that I wanted to start the podcast by asking you to justify the existence of your discipline.
Yeah. So, I mean, one way would be to kind of question that. I mean, I think the best way to it's like a by their fruits you shall know them kind of thing. Like, has sociology come up with insights that are valuable that tell us something about the world?
Yeah.
And one of them I'd start with is to kind of like take your more populist version of the man on the street and the idea that sociology just tells us rich people are evil. I mean, a lot of sociology does claim that, but here's the interesting thing. We were talking about Pierre Bordeaux, right? That Bordeaux shows us that uh, educated people are also evil. Or at least educated people are also snobs. I mean, he has a lot of insights, right? He did some very good gift on gift exchange, but the thing he's most well known for in sociology, as compared to anthropology, where he's known for gift exchange, but in sociology, he's most well known for his class model, which is really, it's like if populist types gave a shit enough about coming up with like, oh, I have a citation for that to prove that I'm right. Bourdieu is who they would point to for all their stuff about the elites, right? Because when a populist talks
Right.
about the elites, they're not really talking about rich people. They're more talking about people with college education and
Right.
powerful, or better yet, graduate degrees and laptop jobs who think they know better than everybody else. And Bourdieu was the first person, well, he wasn't the first, but he was the most important person to talk about how that really is a distinctive social class that has a certain amount of class power, class identity, etc.
Right. So that's actually very interesting. I did not expect this conversation to go there, but that's why I had you on. So just to explain for the audience who are not familiar with Bourdieu, one of his key ideas was precisely, sort of complicated this sort of Marxist notion that it's all about money,
Yeah.
and he had this theory that education, the way it, and sort of especially classical education and the way it's traditionally done, was the point of it was not so much to actually educate people, but to sort of like give you this card that says you're a member of the elite. And so, oh, you can quote Cicero in conversation. Of course, now it all sounds extremely quaint because nobody can quote Cicero in conversation.
Hmm.
But the idea is, we're going to teach kids Cicero, not because we believe Cicero is intrinsically valuable, but because the children of a certain caste will be able to sort of justify their privilege by saying, oh, I learned about Cicero.
Yeah, that's right. So it's in part an argument. I mean, he called it cultural capital, right? So
Yes.
Marx was obsessed with capital. Famously, his 3-volume book was Das Kapital. And what Bourdieu points out, I mean, in some extent, based on Gary Becker, um, James Coleman, Glenn Lowry, American scholars, but there are more forms of capital than just you know Das Kapital, right? Das Kapital means wealth and it means productive machinery, right? So it basically
Right.
means owning a factory. And, obviously Marx was interested in stuff like that. And the Marxists thought that that was the only source of class power that really mattered in modernity. And what Bourdieu points out is that cultural capital is extremely important. And it's interesting that in America, when people talk about education, like American social scientists, if they don't want to just say education, they'll call it human capital.
Right.
And human capital implies that education makes you more productive. And that's probably a good model for something like, imagine getting a degree in chemical engineering. You or I wouldn't know the first thing about how to refine gasoline, you know,
Right. Well,
whereas a
speak for
chemical
yourself,
engineer,
Rossman.
what's that?
Speak for yourself,
Yeah,
Rossman.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what you're doing there in the bunker, but although I hope it's well ventilated if you're refining gasoline. Anyway, um, so if you get a degree in chemical engineering, you actually will know valuable things that you didn't know before you got that degree in chemical engineering. Now, um, if you get the degree in classics, assuming you are in the vast majority of humanity who has never been sent back to ancient Rome via time warp, it's not really that valuable in terms of like
Right.
actual skills that you can accomplish. It's more just a way to show off. Um, and I say this by the way as somebody who I don't speak Latin, but as the meme goes, I am a man, and therefore I am obsessed with ancient Rome, and I have 3 meters, like 10 shelf feet of books on ancient Rome, and I've read them all. But there is a meaningful extent to which it is just kind of like an arbitrary shibboleth of class status.
Yeah, I mean,
Um, and,
I have like a whole rant about classics, but I'm not going to put it there because it's beside the point. But yeah,
well, actually,
essentially,
let's get into a bit. I mean, at the risk of throwing off your the agenda you set first, I think actually, so when the right, I'm not sure whether this is also true in Europe, but in the United States, there's kind of an implicit right wing theory of how to solve education, which is great books and classics.
right.
And I think that doesn't hurt, but I also think it's kind of dumb. Like, it's like, it's like, let me
No,
put it this way:
give
that
us the
market
conservative
is
take against
oversaturated.
classics.
That market is oversaturated,
Right.
and really the human capital deficit is you need people who actually know how to do things. And I understand that the whole idea of great books and classics and everything is like it teaches you how to think. It exposes you to all these great thinkers, etc. There's also a certain pessimism in that, by the way, in that it implies that you can't trust any thinker who put quill to paper less than 200 years ago. Um, unless they were Hayek, right? He's like the one 20th century exception. But I mean, I think ultimately, if you want a movement to have power, it needs people who know how to do things, and that would include
Right.
things like data science and stuff like that. So I have a piece that'll be coming out eventually in City Journal on how the marginal human capital development dollar for right wing philanthropists would not be in great books education, but it would be best spent on basically encouraging conservatives to go to graduate school in the quantitative social sciences.
I mean, I actually pitched some, uh, right wing donors, let's put it that way, on creating like a right wing MIT. So
Mm,
I get your point. I was
yeah,
making a much more specific point about the classics, meaning Greek and Latin, and
sure.
you've heard me say that before, which is that dead languages, and I guess in theory you could use Sanskrit instead of Greek and Latin, but
Hmm.
dead languages is the only non-scientific discipline where there's an objectively correct answer and an objectively wrong answer to the test.
Hmm.
And Therefore, it's the only non-scientific answer discipline where there's very little room for BS to improve your grid. And I'm not saying that the
Well,
other
I don't know. I mean, there are
disciplines
objective
are
answers
are,
in other
are BS.
fields,
I'm just saying, I was a college student in the humanities. Like you can sort of BS your way through some stuff, right?
but
I'm
but
not saying it's completely BS, but there's
you can't
there's a
BS your way through
measure of
dates.
BS.
So, like,
Whereas
I mean, when did you all invade England? If you
what?
say when did you all invade England? If you say
1066.
1065, it's wrong, right?
Yes.
And if you say 1067, it's wrong. 1066 is the objectively correct answer.
Yes, but if you're doing a BA in history, you're not answering quizzes about the
That's right.
Norman invasion of. You're not answering multiple choice questionnaires.
That's in part because historians now are almost exclusively social historians,
Right,
which can
but
be really interesting. I mean, most of those aforementioned classics books are actually social histories of Greece and Rome.
right. I mean, the point is, if you're translating a Latin text, there's an objective answer grid in the way that there is on a math test, and
Hmm.
I mean, unless you're saying that you think it would be better if, history and literature degrees were graded with like SAT style multiple choice questionnaires where there's like an objectively right or wrong answer.
Hmm.
And so, we can, this was basically why Latin, along with math, was like the king and queen of disciplines in the traditional French education system of the Third Republic, because they were sort of doing Bourdieu before Bourdieu. There were the two disciplines that allowed like a poor kid
Hmm.
to excel in the way that history literature didn't.
That was also true in the U.S. in the early 20th century. So, like I mean, to a kind of a stylized history of U.S. elite education in the early 20th century is it used to be that they had a system of recruitment from prep schools, and then they dropped their Greek requirement and only had a Latin requirement, and also did an early version of the SAT. And then they
Right.
found out that a ton of Jews from New York City were getting in to the top colleges.
So they stopped.
Well, they started worrying about Gentile flight, and the the other Ivies would say, like, we don't want to turn into the next Columbia, because apparently Columbia had this catastrophic number of Jews that would make it unappealing for elite Gentiles to attend, and so they introduced a system. They experimented with explicit anti-Jewish quotas, and then they thought it was more subtle to go to basically a well-rounded, holistic admissions criteria, and they'd give points for regional diversity, like it was easier to get in if you were from Montana, because
Yeah.
in part because they
It
knew.
was DEI.
Yeah, it was DEI for WASPs. Yeah, they knew that Montana was entirely Gentiles.
So the woke people in my Twitter mentions are right, which is there's been DEI for white people in America.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, that's right, and also, I mean, you can see this in that when okay, so to carry it forward into the late 20th century, right? So
right,
that was the early history of it. In the late 20th century, you had the activist Ward Connolly get a bunch of ballot initiatives in different states, starting with California, banning affirmative action in state university systems. And there was like a 5-year period where they just, did the old system where there was a lot of weight on SAT and grades.
right,
Because if you're admitting these massive freshman classes, it's very labor intensive to go through, the things one by one and have alumni interview people and stuff like that, like the
right,
private schools do. So they just did that, and then they got a admissions cohorts that were highly white and Asian, and then after about 5 years, they switched to an entirely holistic admission system. So
right,
the state university systems in the post affirmative action era basically adopted the same system in circa the year 2000 that the Ivies had adopted circa the year 1930. That they were both to solve a perceived demographic problem in the
right.
1930s. The perceived demographic problem, 1920s, 1930s, the perceived demographic problem was too many Jews and not enough WASPs. And then in the um, circa 2000, the perceived demographic problem was too many whites and especially too many Asians.
Right. I mean, I think that's interesting because the idea of holistic admissions is something that sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's just like
Well, when you give more
trying
when
to
you
do
make things
shenanigans.
fuzzy, you give discretion. It's one of those, what is it? The will of the sovereign. Decide.
Yeah,
It's like when you increase discretion, you increase power.
right,
And when you make things fuzzy, you increase discretion, and that's
right,
part of the whole point.
right.
And likewise, there was I wrote an article for NR, like, I don't know, 6 years ago, where the top prep schools in America were trying to abandon grades and go to like
Yeah,
a holistic evaluation packet. And the very explicit point was that they didn't want to have class rank because they didn't
right,
want admissions officers to be able to compare their students, because then only two of them could get into Harvard, whereas all of them should
right,
get into
right, right,
Harvard.
right. Yes, this is why also my alma mater strongly resists giving equivalent of cum laude and so on the degree because they want all of the degrees to have the same
Well,
value,
the joke in the U.S. is that they keep having to
which is
readjust
very good
the
for me, by the way.
yeah, because the missing data we can impute as the bottom quartile, but in the U.S. they keep having to readjust what counts as cum laude and magna cum laude and summa cum laude because grade inflation is so ridiculous. So at UCLA, I think the median grade, or the mean grade, I think the median GPA for graduating senior is something like 3.7,
Wow.
which is an A minus.
Yeah. Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, no, I mean, this is I have grown so much more appreciative of the French education system over the past, 20 years of interacting with American culture.
Yeah.
Because yeah, we well, first of all, it's a competitive merit-based exam to get in.
Hmm.
Um and then you're graded on a curve, and it causes a problem because my alma mater introduced letter grades, except they did it properly. So it's very hard to get an A and a B.
Hmm.
And so they actually, y- if you want to apply to an American university,
Mm.
you tell the office and they give you a special transcript.
Translate into America, where
It,
they
it,
like
basi-
they
it
raise every
basically
grade by like two full
all
letter
the letter,
grades.
all the C's and B's are turned into A's and the A's into A pluses.
Wait, this is your undergrad alma mater or your MBA?
This is my MBA. Yeah.
Yeah, because like in America, MBAs are notorious grade grubbers, um, and so there tends to be very high GPAs for MBA programs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't technically an MBA. It's the so-called Grande École system. So, uh,
Also, a major feature in Bordeaux, where
yes. Well,
like in
I mean, the
distinction,
the
there's all
whole
these graphs
thing.
where he like labels like Grand École, and that's where you see people saying that like tree bark is a more appealing subject for photographs than folk dancing.
Well, I mean,
It's you people.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I liked about the American system was that the ranking system was more fuzzy.
Among the higher
Um,
education.
yes.
No, I don't
Uh,
know about that, because I mean, we publish magazines that rank schools every year,
yeah, I know,
and
but like
they'll put them on their website. So like
people
you
take it
cannot look at
super
something at UCLA that
seriously.
doesn't say the number one public school in America. Like, we're very proud of that. That we're the
Yeah,
highest ranked public university.
yeah, but see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but if you were applying to undergrad in
I mean,
America, you would.
I'm not, this is not to take a dig on UCLA and its beautiful campus, but like if somebody tells me, "Oh, I went to Michigan," I don't think, "Oh, that's only the second best public school in America." I don't have like a strong sense in my head. Or if somebody, goes to Harvard versus Stanford versus MIT, I don't immediately rank them in my
Well,
head.
people in
Whereas
the relevant
in France, it's
fields
very
do.
clear that there's one on the top, and then there's a second, and there's a
Okay,
third.
so actually, we can get back to your original thing of like, does sociology have anything to offer? Like, justify our existence, because apparently you're the Saint Peter of academia. So
I
the
I was hoping to be the Attila the Hun,
yeah,
but
okay. If our sins were not so great, God would not have sent you against us. Uh, or was that Genghis Khan? Some guy
I
on
think that
horses with
one
a
was
bow.
Genghis
Yeah,
Khan.
yeah. Okay. So
Attila
anyways,
is the one where the grass doesn't grow back on the ground that his armies have tread.
yeah, but it was Attila who was called the Scourge of God, I think.
Yes.
So one expressed himself in that way, and the other. So basically, both of them, in some sense,
Yes.
were Scourge of God. Anyway, so back to like the findings.
I'll take Genghis Khan. I'm an open-minded guy.
Yeah, that's right. Larger harem too. Like you don't hear about 4% of all men alive today have till the Hunn's Y chromosome,
Well,
or
one
whatever the
reason
number
is we
is.
have basically no sources on Attila. We don't even know what he looked like.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we just know that he was from somewhere northeast of Rome, but we don't
Yes.
know how far
Yes. We
northeast.
actually know very little about the Huns,
Hmm.
much less than about the Mongols. And so presumably he had a large harem. It would be surprising if he didn't, but
Uh
we
huh.
don't actually know anything about it.
Who knows? Maybe he was celibate.
Maybe.
Your
Part of
rare
the game. The
ascetic
game.
step warlord. Right. So, anyway, so back to justifying my discipline's continued existence, um, and this will kind of anticipate the other thing that we want to talk about later. One of the really interesting findings lately is what was sometimes called market information regimes, which is the
Okay.
idea, as if you just break it down, right? It's like markets are ruled by information, like systematic
Yeah.
structures for information control how markets work. And the canonical example of that is law schools,
Yeah.
because law schools are ranked by US News and World Report. And there's this, they publish a ranking every year, and it's a highly salient piece of information for
Yeah.
people applying to law schools. And law schools really care about their rankings, because if
Yeah.
you're Yale and you're competing with Stanford for the very best students, you want to make sure that in 20 years that Supreme Court justice has a Yale degree, not a Stanford degree.
Yeah.
And then if you're the University of Buttfuck, and you're competing with Buttfuck State, you want to compete just to get more tuition. And so you really
Right.
care not if you're number one or number two, but you want to care if you're number 67 or 68. And because for any given student, that's a relevant choice set. And so law schools really care about this. And there's been some good work showing that on a day-to-day basis, law school deans basically go through their day thinking not what is going to make us the best law school, but what is going to make us the best law school as
Yeah.
measured by US
Yeah.
News and World Report. And to the extent that US News's measurements are only loosely coupled to actual quality, it's the perception or the measurement that matters more, not the reality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that they're totally irrelevant, but, well, one sociological fact, which I thought was very interesting, I saw it on the internet, therefore it's true, although it's old, and it would be interesting to see if it's changed. If you look at students who were admitted to both Harvard and Yale,
Hmm.
the ones who pick Yale over Harvard is about 30%. If you look at HEC and ESSEC, which would be the equivalents, the ones who are admitted to both and who choose the number two, it's 3%.
Okay. So there's
And
more of like
so
a
you
strict ranking. Yeah.
right. And so
Wait, which one is
if you meet a
which one
kid
is number one and number
who's
two?
like, "Well, I got into Harvard, but I chose
Uh huh.
Yale because there's this professor or this thing," you don't immediately think you're crazy. If you run into a kid who says, "Oh, I got into HSA, but I chose ESSEC," you think, "Oh my god, you made the biggest mistake of your life when you were
Oh, so
20,
you
and now
did go
you."
to the number two.
No, I did go no, I no, I went to the number 1.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Honestly, didn't know
I
whether HSA was number one or number two. I mean, I know it's a good
oh,
school,
it's
but
absolutely number 1,
uh huh.
um,
Wow.
as
So,
as
so,
acknowledged by
so what you're
everybody.
talking
So
about
I
this
I do
issue
think the
of mhm.
hierarchy is stronger.
So this issue of how often does somebody pick this one versus that one, um, and presumably, let's say that I'm sorry, what was the second school besides HSA?
It's called ESSEC,
Okay,
which sounds
so let's say
suspiciously close to échec, which is failure in French, and we like
okay.
to remind you of that.
Okay, so your metric of how often people choose HSA versus SX. This is like a you could use this to say that there's a strong preference for this, and then you could say how often do they choose SEC over um, INSEAD, right? So you could have like all these pairwise. You could basically imagine doing like a hot or not type thing for business schools,
Yeah.
where you like put up two business schools and you have people who are interested in that sort of thing clicking on which business school they choose if they were admitted to both. And a colleague at Princeton, Matt Solganic, actually developed this algorithm where he said one way to collect data on rankings is that you just basically give people hot or not, where you give them paired choices. And then when you do that, you can treat that as a social network, and then you put it into a asymmetrical centrality metric like Bonasich and Lloyd alpha centrality or PageRank, and then you can use that to measure status. And
Yeah.
status is, of course, a key sociological concept, very active area in the literature. I've done work similar to that on measuring who's the biggest movie star, and
Right.
then validating it, and kind of just for it started out as a lecture, but I published it in kind of an informal. It's like a social magazine, although it's technically peer reviewed. But I actually did this with the Iliad, where if you look at who going back to classics, right? If you look at which warrior defeats which warrior in a fight, and then you say like, okay, well, Odysseus beat Trojan number 47. Who gives a shit? Whereas Achilles kills Hector. I apologize for the spoilers, but it's 3,000 years you've had to read it, right? If
Well,
Achilles kills Hector,
all of
Hector
my
kills
viewers
Patroclus,
have
but
read their
Patroclus,
classics. If
yeah,
not, get out.
yeah,
Close the
Patroclus kills a
window.
fuckload of anonymous Trojans. That that's how you know that Achilles is the biggest badass in the Iliad. It's not because he
Right.
kills the most people. There's actually several warriors who kill more people than Achilles does. It's because he kills Hector, and
Right.
Hector's a badass because Hector kills a lot of people, including killing
Patroclus.
Patroclus, who kills a lot of people.
Right. Yes. Okay.
So it's the same basic
Uh.
idea for ranking business schools as for
Right. 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 No. Yeah. It's
ranking.
a cool algorithm, and you said
Yeah,
a lot of math things. So I am
Cleos
careful
Apthethon.
judging sociology a worthy discipline.
Okay.
I will tell Elon to cut your funding by only 90%.
Yeah.
Um. Let's talk about social construction.
All right.
Uh, you had so way back in the day, you had a very funny blog post about this, and I've probably sent it to a million people over the years.
Thank you.
And you are also writing an article about this, and
Yeah,
so
that article should be
basically,
out soon in Compact.
okay, great.
Yeah.
Basically, the way I think about this is when people talk about social construction, there's like three things people can mean. There's like the popular version. There's I wrote it in my notes as the Steelman lib version. So I'm going to ask you to
Hmm.
like Steelman the bad version of social construction, and then there's what social construction actually means in sociological theory.
Yeah.
So what first of all, what would you say is the popular version of it?
Well, I'd say the popular version of it is kind of like, um, oh, that's just a social construct, man. Like it's
Yeah.
it's almost hard to express verbally because you need to imagine the exhalation of cannabis smoke as you're saying it, right? It's like this idea of
Uh,
like, well, have you ever realized that's just a social construct? And I think like bad versions of social construction almost always inappropriately include the word just. I think there
right.
are things that where you can appropriately use the word just and social construction in the same sentence, but it's so
I
here's
mean,
my simple rule. Mhm.
outlawing alcohol and not outlawing cannabis or vice versa is absolutely a social construct.
Well, I wouldn't call that a social construct. I would say that we have socially
Or
constructed.
viewing one as licit and viewing the other as illicit.
I would say that deviance is socially constructed, and that includes what social associations we have with different chemicals. Now, that's actually a good example because alcohol has an objective set of properties on the brain. So does THC.
Right.
Right? These are things that if you go to a neurologist, you force rats to consume these substances, whatever, you can scientifically measure these things. So it's not as if we we could just imagine that I don't know, seltzer water. Like
Right.
you could imagine a society that has a moral panic about seltzer water.
Right.
But that would be a dumb thing to imagine because seltzer
Right.
water is basically harmless, and it
You
certainly
know what
doesn't have
else is objectively medically proven to exist? Genitalia. And yet,
well, I mean, I don't want to hurt myself, but wasn't it Hume who said about Berkeley, "I refute it thusly by kicking a rock"? It's like
yes.
both of us are in position to punch ourselves and refute it thusly. So,
Okay, so all right, so let's stop joking around.
yeah.
If I say, for example, um, opening marriage to same-sex couples is
Hmm.
totally fine because even though it's unprecedented in human history, marriage is just a social construct. What
Well,
am I
marriage is
saying?
um, so that is a so that's implicit in a lot of the claims about things being social constructions, which imply so very often there's the implication that if this thing is somewhat arbitrary, if this thing is not
Yeah.
completely determined by the laws of nature, like the periodic table of the elements, then we can change it any way we like.
Yes.
And I don't think that necessarily follows. Um, because so the whole idea, first of all, there are some social constructions you can imagine that don't follow the laws of nature as well as others. So, you know, the idea that there could be a social problem around alcohol use, or the idea that there could be a social problem around cannabis use, these are somewhat plausible beliefs because these actually
Yeah.
are psychoactively chemicals. Like that's objectively
Yes.
true. There's a material reality to cannabinoids, opioids,
Yes.
alcohol affecting specific neurotransmitters, et cetera, in various ways that are just objectively true, and you can replicate them in lab animals, which would not be true about, say, chewing gum, where
Right.
you could imagine people saying chewing gum creates unattractive litter, it gets stuck to your shoe, something like that. But nobody's going to think people ruin their lives by becoming chewing gum addicts. Like, oh my god, first thing when that guy wakes up, he has a piece of chewing gum. What a fucking loser! Nobody's
Right.
going to think that in the same way that they would about a wake and bake stoner or somebody who drinks before noon.
Yeah.
So,
So
mhm.
e- explain what social construction means to serious sociologists, and then maybe we can talk about how it became memed into this sort of, you know, first why it's a valuable concept in sociology, and then how it became memed into this instrument of social destruction.
Sure. So, social construction really hit it big in sociology with Berger and Luckman's, I think it was 1967 book, The Social Construction of Reality. Um, Interestingly, for the way people have associations with this, Berger was actually a political conservative, and he wrote a column for a conservative magazine until very close to his death around 10 years ago. Um, but so the basic idea is that there is a material reality. We all have perceptions of material reality. Material reality. So far, this is just Plato's allegory of the cave, Paul's
Yeah.
metaphor of the dim mirror, etc. Um, so, but what makes it distinctly social is it's not just that I have perceptions and you have perceptions; is that we have shared perceptions. So, looking in the background of your photo, I see the French flag. Now, objectively, that is not the French flag. Objectively, that's just a piece of cloth that's in three colors. But
Right.
you and I agree that that represents, La France. So we have this symbolic association with it. Um, you can imagine somebody who doesn't know that, right? It's very easy to imagine somebody who's never seen that flag, doesn't know what country it stands for, etc. But because um, you know very large numbers of people recognize that flag, know what it stands for. Um, it has these set of associations that are completely arbitrary, right? You could imagine a counterfactual France where the red is on the left and the blue is on the right.
Right.
and it would substantively be the same country, and so it's completely arbitrary.
In fact, during
Which
the revolution, there were many different versions of this sort of tricolor.
That's not surprising, right? And sometimes, and that is a thing that when symbols develop, you sometimes see a certain diversity that then gets kind of honed in on as people
Right.
recognize it. So the key concept that Berger and Lechman talk about is intersubjectivity, which is that it doesn't matter what I believe or what you believe, it matters what we believe. And once enough
Right.
people believe something, it is for all practical purposes a material fact. Now that I'm not saying that in the sense of like the hippies thought that if they all concentrated really hard, they could make the Pentagon levitate. Right. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that if
Yeah.
we all agree on something, we have magical powers. But I am saying that there's a sense where if I walk around with, like, let's say that I wanted to impersonate a French soldier for some heist I was doing, and I had a flag on my arm that had the red on the left and the blue on the right, I would quickly
Right.
be spotted as an imposter because we've all
Right.
agreed that the French flag has the blue on the left and the red on the right. And likewise, money is the ultimate example of a social construction. And
Right.
like, why is a dollar valuable, or for that matter, why is silver valuable? And it's not so much because the intrinsic, I mean, a dollar is worthless. It's just a piece of high cotton
Right.
paper. It's not even a
Right.
full A4 size piece of paper. So but it's valuable because we all agree that it's valuable.
Right.
um, and so the intersubjectivity is what makes it matter. Now they further talked about things like institutions and roles, which is basically when these things become highly typified, they get worked into like concrete things. Um, so and we had one example of this, by the way. Earlier we were talking about market information regimes. So rankings matter, prizes matter, right? If you're a book publisher in
Right.
France, you really want to win the Goncourt, because
Right.
it raises your sales.
Right.
If you're, it's not quite as true as it used to be, but if you're a film studio in America, you really want to win the Oscars because it raises your sales.
Right.
So these ways of structuring information can have concrete effects on how markets work. Um, Karpik, who's, I forget which, I think he's at the Mines School, the Grand École Mines, their business school.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Karpik has done very good work on market information regimes.
Okay. So I guess my next question. So I guess I have two questions now. Number one, I agree with everything you just said. It seems very nice and fine, but like, why is this interesting? It seems like a banal observation about the world. Like,
So,
oh, the blue, white, red. There's nothing intrinsically about it that makes it French. It only
well,
represents
yeah,
something.
that's a
We
very
all
trite
agree, like,
example.
okay, but that's true, but it's true in the sense that the sky is blue. It's not an interesting fact about the world.
Well, it's actually not true in the sense that the sky is blue, because the sky is
Right.
blue in a way that if we imagine, it's hard to imagine a plausible alternate universe where the Earth is fit for human habitation
No, I
and the
mean,
sky's not blue.
it it's the same it's a truth that is banal in that
Yeah,
sense,
so I'm willing to
right?
say that the symbol signifier thing is a banal truth, and it's not worth having an entire discipline that is largely organized around exploring it. I think market information regimes is a non-trivial insight. The idea that the way information is structured in markets matters a lot. That on a day-to-day basis, what actually matters in markets is not quality of goods, but quality of goods as measured by highly salient pieces of information that rank the good. So, a restaurant being a good restaurant may matter less than whether it has Michelin stars or a good Yelp
Right,
rating.
right,
And if there are things that you can do to get Michelin stars or to get a good Yelp rating that are only loosely connected to how good the food tastes,
yeah,
then you're going to see restaurants focusing on pleasing the Michelin people or encouraging ordinary people to file positive Yelp reviews.
right, right,
So,
okay,
so that's one non-trivial insight. I think there's other ways also where it can be a good sensitizing concept to recognize that kind of plausible counterfactuals about the way we understand things, some of which can be based on historical comparison, some of which can be based on cross-cultural comparison.
right,
So, in the Compact article, I give the example of the social construction of race, where
Right.
people like to say race is socially constructed, and this is also a good example of like where do you get to the hippie example, right? Somebody says race is just a social construct. That's obviously dumb because you can look at me and you can tell that my ancestors are from Europe,
Right.
and you know, um, and it's not like you're just imagining that. Um, so so there's a way in which and I've spit in a tube and mailed it to 23andMe and gone on Amazon and paid them $100, and it's like, you know what, they were able to figure out exactly where my great 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 grandparents lived 500 years ago, like with amazing precision. Like they know exactly where my ancestors came from, um, and it wasn't because I told them. All I did was spit in the tube and pay them $100. So there's a sense in which race is a material reality, um, which is especially demonstrated by 23andMe. But there's also a sense in which it's socially constructed,
Yes.
and because there are other plausible ways to understand how people are, um, how to categorize ancestral variation
Right.
other than the way that we do it in, say, the United States.
Right.
So the best example of these are Latino and Asian, both of which are relatively recent racial
Right.
categorizations. So Latino is just a total mess, right? I mean, you can find Latino people who are mostly black. You can find Latino people who are, mostly
Paler
white.
than you
They
and
they used
me.
to be called criollos in Latin America. Um, you know, you can find people who are mostly Indian. Mostly
Yes.
American Indian ancestry. You can find people who are um, you're typical Mexican, who, by the way, is very good at making sandwiches, contrary to your expectations. I know you're a torta denialist, and I will not stand for it. So um, your average Mexican is something like, I don't know, half
This
Indian and
for the audience, this is like a deep inside joke between Gabriel and me.
well, it started out as an inside joke, and then you offended me so much you realized that you decided to offend all of Twitter with it, and you were the main
Yes.
character for like a day.
Yes.
Anyway,
Well, yes. I also went viral on Twitter one day for saying bad things about Mexican food, which I quite enjoy. I enjoy many types of food. For example, I
in fact,
noticed
we've
the
enjoyed it
jar
together.
pickles
I was
is
thinking
on the
this. I was a
screen,
jar
which
of
is
pickles.
very bad of me. But I told you this was a low production values podcast,
Uh-huh.
and I really, really enjoy Russian type pickles, which are large like this, and which are hard to find in France. So I found one last week, and I've been nibbling on it ever since. And I should have kept it out of screen. And now
Uh-huh.
you gave me a perfect segue to mention the very awkward jar of pickles.
Uh-huh. I can think of more awkward things that could be in the frame, but
Sure.
as embarrassing things to have on your webcam, go. Jar of pickles is pretty low on the list.
Yeah, well, no comment.
Anyway,
Um,
the point is, like your typical Mexican person is something like half Indian, 45% European, and 5% black.
yeah,
So it's like, eh, so there's a way in which, and then your typical Chilean person is basically the same three ancestries, but a very different ratio,
right.
where they're probably more like 80% European.
Yeah,
So you can ask, like, and then there's other countries like the Dominican Republic where people are like half European and half African.
right,
So in the United States, we call all these people Latino, even though they don't
right,
look anything like each other. Some of them
right,
look just like me,
right,
and some of them look very much like the people who were living there before Columbus.
right.
And but we categorize all these people as Latino, and it was completely, actually, my office mate in grad school wrote a very good book on this. Um, I think it was called Creating Hispanics. I remember the original title was in Spanish. It was I think it was like De Muchos Unidos or something like that. Anyway, but Christina Moore at Berkeley. So it's like, where do you get this racial category? And there's a specific story about that. But at a certain point now, there are some people. I mean, I think it is actually more salient now that people will think of themselves by their national origin categories, right? People are more likely to think of themselves as, I'm Salvadoran, or I'm Mexican, or I'm Colombian, or
Right,
I'm Cuban, or whatever. But there is a sense in which, if you they they don't roll their eyes when they check the box that says Latino.
right.
They do think of themselves as Latino in some meaningful sense. Asian is an even better example because,
Right.
I mean, in the United States, we decided, I think for the 1970 census, to put East Asians and South Asians together under the category
Yes.
Asian.
Which
And
is
you could look at a Pakistani and you can look at a Korean, and they don't look anything like each other, right? The
right.
Pakistani basically looks like a European with darker skin, and whereas the Korean has a very different, a very different hair texture, different eyes, different
Okay. So
incisors, right? I mean, there's
how
all sorts of. Mhm.
okay, so we socially constructed categories like Latino and Asian.
Yes,
Sorry to sorry to like stupidly harp on this. Why is it interesting? Why
it's
is it
interesting
interesting to
because the
notice
the
this?
bullshit
Why is
categories
it
matter.
interesting to write about it? Why is it interesting to investigate it?
So it's interesting because when you treat the category as real, it becomes real in some meaningful sense. So there are institutions that are premised on the notion of Latino, or that were premised
Yeah.
on the notion of Asian. And even though those categories basically didn't exist 50 years ago, they do now. And over the course of 50 years, things can become kind of entrenched. And so, many universities will have like an Asian American Studies department. And you will see people
Yeah,
in
yeah,
these
yeah.
departments who, don't look like each other, come from parts of the world that, you know, don't, so some people will broadly be within the broad Chinese cultural sphere of influence,
Right.
Korea, Japan, places that, um, would use Mandarin characters for at least some ritual purposes and, have a certain
Yeah.
amount of technological cultural overlap. Um, then you'll also have people from South Asia who don't look anything like them, but they're all in the same departments, and they will kind of like they'll talk about the great diversity of Asians, and they're right to, but they'll also like at a certain point kind of assume that these things have something in common.
Right.
So and this was basically the reason, not so much with the origins of Asian, which actually originated when South Asian small business people wanted to be eligible for small business loans, eh,
uh,
which because and you can't do that if you were categorized as
well,
Caucasian.
I mean, given the service of rooftop Koreans, I think that's one of the
Well,
more
no, but this
defensible
was
ones.
South Asians, not East
Yes.
Asians, right? East
Well,
Asians were always categorized separately from white
haven't we
people.
just established that all Asians are the same? No, wait. Was
No,
I was
but
I
the
not
census
listening?
has, right? I mean, the census does assume that implicitly, especially if you get the short form census where it just asks you your race, it doesn't ask you
The
your specific ancestry. But
Okay, so all right, we've established that social construction is a real concept in sociology. We've established that it's interesting to look at the way things are socially constructed. How did we get from that to men in dresses demanding that I put pronouns after my signature?
well, here's the ironic thing: is that I think particularly with gender, you can see cases where people who embrace the concept of the social construction of gender reject its implications, and people who are skeptical in the abstract of the concept of the social construction of gender, um, actually embrace certain hypotheses that are, strictly speaking, social constructionist hypotheses. So the way that we treat it, so I'm not interested in what people say. I'm interested in what they. Well, I'm not interested in what shibboleths people adopt. I'm more interested in like what ideas people substantively have.
Right.
And one of the emerging ideas about, well, actually, emerging, it may pass its zenith, but one of the ideas that is relatively recent about gender is that people have a deep, well, recent in Western culture. You can actually, so here's the ironic thing: we see um, the growth of trans as like a novel thing, but in many ways, there are it. If you look at the broad sweep of comparative gender and sexuality, it's probably more common to have trans people than it is to have gender conforming homosexual people. Like your
In some
typical,
cultures, maybe.
yeah.
Although
Mhm.
I would dispute that they're trans, but
Well, so
that's a much broader and
so there
different thing.
are. Let me put it this way: there are
I
There are many traditional cultures that have a culturally understood category for a third gender which
Yes.
very often consists of male
Right. And a
attracted
third
males
gender is
who
not the
adopt
same thing
feminine
as
dress and feminine
transgender.
social roles.
Right.
So,
No, but
so
I
it's
guess
the
the
closest analog to such people in our cultures, at least until recently, would be trans. Whereas, in the 1990s in the US, and I imagine also in France, there were some trans people, most of whom were male attracted males, but
yes.
it was much more common to have um, males who saw themselves as men, everyone else saw themselves as men. They just were sexually attracted to other men, right? So the concept of a gay man, in some sense, is the weird
Yes.
uh, concept, right? Weird in the Western, educated,
Yes.
industrialized, rich,
Yes.
and democratic exceptionalism thing. Um, Whereas
I
trans, in some sense, is like almost like a reversion to the cultural norm.
Right. I mean, what so let me rephrase my question. I wasn't asking about trans specifically. I guess my question was more, how did the notion of social construction became to be socially constructed
Yeah,
as
that's right.
a sort of license for delegitimizing and eventually destroying every sort of hallowed or historic cultural institution,
So I think so. What
including the
social
gender
construction?
binary,
Mhm.
including marriage, including whatever.
So
Like,
what social construction
what
does?
was the
Mhm.
conceptual shift, or what was the move that led to that?
So the conceptual shift is that if you recognize something as culturally contingent, it holds out the possibility that it could be arranged in another way.
Right.
Um, and so if you don't like the way something is currently arranged, now there's a lazy version of this, which is what I think people are doing, where they just assume that just flagging something as social construction means that they can do whatever they want with it.
Yeah.
And I in the blog post you were mentioning, I refer to this as the ruby slippers conception
Right.
of social construction that simply recognize. So, like in the Wizard of Oz, once Dorothy learns that her ruby slippers are magical, all she has to do is click her heels and she goes back to Kansas. She's had the shoes the whole fucking time. It's just she
Right.
only at the end realizes that they're magical. So, or at least how to use them. So, this idea of social construction, some people take it as like, well, if you realize that race is a social construction or gender is a social construction, you can just do it any way you want. And there can sometimes, very often, people will do this with kind of a denial of material reality, which was
Yeah.
not present in Berger and Luckman. Berger and Luckman were very clear that material reality exists, right? That like there is something there that like if you walk off a cliff, even if you don't believe in gravity, you will still die.
Right.
So, um, but sometimes the lazy way that both its critics and its advocates will use social construction and is the idea that it's somehow mutually exclusive with material reality. That if
Yeah.
you simply recognize something as a social construction, you can do anything you want with it because it's completely. Where it's like, well, that's not true because material reality is a constraint. There are certain uh, there's limits to how much you can modify things,
Yeah.
because ultimately material reality is there, and some social constructions that we can imagine are more compatible with the underlying material reality than the other.
Right.
So, so science is a social construction, so is astrology, but
Right.
science is one that is a much closer fit with the underlying material reality than is astrology.
Right. That's hate speech, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess um this is my take on it, and I haven't seen anywhere else, even though
Hmm.
I it seems like a perfectly banal observation, which is, if you look at something like gender, it's a social construction, but it's a social construction that exists not just over, but in response to
That's right.
an underlying biological reality, which is that, men and women have they're different physically and physiologically. There are also neurological differences, which is there's a trans sidebar there too, because for a decade, I was, insulted on social media for saying that there are neurological differences between men and women, and now it's been taken up by trans people to say, "Oh no, I have a female brain."
Yeah. Well,
Um,
this is one of the interesting ironies with trans is that in some ways, so people who advocate for trans will say gender is a social construct, and
yeah,
people who are will call themselves gender critical, and their critics would call them turfs, um, will say gender is not a social construct. But then the gender critical people will say things like rapid onset gender dysphoria spreads as a social contagion.
right,
And it's like something can't spread as a social contagion unless it's a social construction, right? So it's like,
right, and yeah, okay,
COVID is not, well, I mean, everything in some sense, but like COVID is not in any material sense socially constructed. It's like
right. The
your
virus
COVID
is the virus.
statistics are, but the actual virus is not, right? So like COVID spreads because it's a respiratory virus,
Right,
whereas and so whereas if the ROGD hypothesis holds that it spreads because it's a meme,
right,
and it's like, well, something can't spread socially unless it's socially constructed.
right, right. Um, that's my co-host, by the
Yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah. So, and related to this, right? The view that you'll see of like, oh, this is my real brain, or maybe they'll,
Right,
like you could show neurologically. If you gave me an MRI, you'd be able to show this.
right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe for
And
some
by
people
the
it
way,
actually is
studies
true.
have tried to show this, and they've consistently showed that no, that's not true.
Okay, so
Small samples, though, the studies I'm aware of, small samples, so it's usually like 10, 15, 20 people. Maybe there have been more, but like all of them have shown the same results.
I'd want to see it based on like the different causes, right? Because there's many different types of trans
Yeah.
people, and it would not surprise me if some of them their their neurology is a little bit shifted towards the opposite sex, and then others they're just like super typical of their
I mean
natal sex.
that's possible.
Yeah,
You should apply for an NIH grant.
if any still exist, and right.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
We're we're getting close to the end of our hour. There's an amazing AI schoolwork story that I won't be able to tell. But I'm going to ask you the last question that we ask of every guest, which is recommend a book. It can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, whatever, outside your area of expertise.
Oh shit. So I don't have anything on the top of my head. I was gonna say, well, of course I should just recommend Peterson Burger because it's so much better than people think. Like I expected to hate it and then I read it. And I'm like, this is totally sensible. Everything makes sense. Oh man.
Yeah, that's why it's an interesting question because otherwise it's too easy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would have prepared this, but I'm just gonna go on my Kindle account. And oh, you know what? Okay, so the Kindle book I'm reading now is Greenberg's Construction of Sexuality. Now that is
Yeah,
social science. It is,
that's still
but
sociology.
I
Sorry.
am not a. Well, actually, I think okay. So first of all, he is an anthropologist, not a sociologist. And second of all, I'm not a specialist in sexuality. So, but if that's still too close for you, right? If that's like, if I say what's your favorite country and it can't be France, you say I don't know, Belgium. You know, that then
I mean, if you want to make that your final answer, you can make that. But like, try, play along.
well, yeah, I'm happy to play along. I just need to
I've
look.
socially constructed this test, and
Oh,
so
okay. So
now
so
it
here's
makes
one.
it
Okay, so a very good
reality.
book I'm very fond of is Ronald Hutton's The Witch.
Okay.
So um, Hutton is one of the top historians of the occult,
Okay.
and he in The Witch he gives this huge overview of a comparative study of witchcraft, and so he
Wow.
synthesizes 20th century ethnographies in Asia and Africa of modern witchcraft, and the Americas. So basically, modern peoples who still practice witchcraft, and then he compares that to classics and how was witchcraft practiced in Egypt, Greece, and Rome,
Wow.
and then he compares that to his main area of expertise, which is the early modern witch hunt, and he points out that some things you can find in common with all these witch scares.
Yeah.
Um, and witch hunts and practices of witchcraft, and other things are totally arbitrary. So, for instance, in the West, we very often have this assumption that because we're basing ourselves on the model of the early modern European witch hunt, which is an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation,
Yep.
um, that you know. witch hunts were femicide, right? That witch hunts were
Right.
about misogyny. Interestingly, by the way, the Nazis believe that too. There was an SS officer who put like 12 man years into cataloging every witch trial in the history of Germany, with the aim of showing that it was Semitic Christianity's final attempt to suppress, um, you know,
Oh my god.
pagan survivalism as like the authentic
That
German
is
spirit.
high tier German autism.
Well, yeah, that's right. So, I mean, there are certainly worse things that SS officers could have been doing at the time, right, than cataloging witch burnings. So, I mean,
I
the funny thing now is that if you talk to somebody today and
there's
you
a Norm Macdonald joke in there,
yeah,
like,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
I thought
So
the worst things was the
yeah,
obsessive cataloging. No, I thought the
yeah, the
good
worst thing
things
was Shoah.
were
Yeah, exactly. So and trying to conquer all of Europe.
yes,
So
yes. For the record,
yeah.
the mass genocide of Jews and other minorities was worse.
Yeah. So yeah, and I agree. So, but by many orders of magnitude, if anything, so it was a bad dissertation, but still was just a dissertation. So, but the ironic thing is that if you talk to somebody today and they tell you like, oh, the witch hunts were a final attempt by Christianity to suppress, um,
The
European pagan
intent,
survivalism, that
yeah,
person
yeah,
is usually a feminist, usually
right,
sees themselves on the left, but they
right,
they agreed with Himmler,
right, right, right.
which doesn't mean it is a bad idea in the sense that it's incorrect, but it doesn't mean that it's an evil idea. I'm not saying that the person. Well, going to the occult bookstore is probably not the greatest thing to do for your soul, but it doesn't make you a Nazi. So
Right.
anyway, so he talks about the early modern European witch hunt, but this idea that witch hunts were fundamentally about patriarchy
Right.
is an ethnocentric idea, because it's premised on the idea that is basically accurate that most of the early modern European witch hunt was accusations against women, but that's
Yes.
simply not true comparatively. There's many, many cultures where
Oh,
the
okay.
average witch trial victim or the average person lynched as a witch is a man. So
Oh,
in
okay.
Africa, every 10 years or so, there's a scare about penis theft.
Yes.
Anthropologists call this koro, which is the Malay word for turtle, because it's the idea of like if you imagine
Oh,
like a
right.
turtle pulling its head back into its shell, like
Right.
and this occurred in the early modern European witch hunt. It's a very common feature of witch hunts. It's not something you see when you watch The Crucible performed or something like that. But there's a very common belief that witches steal penises. Every 10 years or so in modern Africa, there'll be a scare that witches, usually men, are stealing penises, and a mob will just go and lynch the person.
By the way, a quote unquote red pill is if you sort of semi regularly go to Google News and just type human sacrifice Africa, there's always new. Anyway, go on.
Okay, yeah,
So
I mean, yeah,
human sacrifice is ongoing in Africa and sort of regularly occurs.
yeah, but I mean, probably an important fact would be that it's seen as deviant locally. Like, I don't think there's any cultures where it's seen as like a socially accepted thing. Like, it may be something for like obscure cults to do or something like that.
Well, I mean, it depends whether you're talking about the actual culture or the government, which is dependent on $8. I honestly don't know. Certainly in Muslim countries, it would be considered deviant.
Hmm.
Anyway, no. Finish your point about the witches. I thought the point. My assumption. See, I was just too bathed in feminist queer studies.
Yeah.
My assumption was that quote unquote witchcraft was linked to I forget the expression doulas. I mean, it's not typically, but like
Oh,
women
like
who help
Manichaeism.
women deliver and who are also medicine women who are also sort of associated with occult practices, and that's why it was sort of like female
So it
dominated.
could be. I mean, and that might have been the case in early modern Europe. Yeah, now, it's definitely not the case that but that's part of right. So in order to make what's called the Murray thesis, because Murray who was an Egyptologist, but she got asked to write the thing on witchcraft for Encyclopedia Britannica. That's how this theory got popularized. Although it wasn't the only reason, because like I said, the Nazis believed it too. Um, the Murray thesis, in order for it to make sense, it couldn't be that these people were accused for no reason whatsoever, or just like personal grudges or something like that. It had to be that they were doing something that at least superficially resembled witchcraft. And so that hones in on the idea that these were all like traditional herbalists or
Right.
folk medicine people. Some of
Right.
them were, right. There were some people who were practicing folk medicine, folk herbalism, and those people got accused. Such people were
And
often
some of
women.
them were practicing something that they believed was witchcraft.
Well, many of them were doing things that they believed. Some of them, not all of them, believed that they were doing things which they considered to be white magic. Um,
Right.
they very few, if any of them. Well, there probably were a handful, but very few people who were accused in the early modern era actually believed themselves to be having made pacts with Satan
Okay.
to
Yeah.
grant themselves
But
supernatural power over
they
their
were
neighbors.
engaged in sort of occult practices.
Some of them were, yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
So, but they saw themselves as engaging in benign
Right.
magic that
Right.
would very often include Christian prayers.
Interesting. All right. Well, see, I prodded you to come up with a recommendation that fit the thing, and that was excellent and fascinating. All right. I thank you very much. I
Yeah,
want to take
good
up
talking to you.
more of your time. So it turns out that not all sociologists need to be thrown into a volcano. That's very good news
So
for.
now you believe in human sacrifice, but or is it that you don't think we're
No,
people?
just retribution. Just
Okay, I see.
your.
So it's not to help Pele. It's just to hurt us.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Exactly. Joking aside, this was all fascinating. Thank you very
yeah,
much
good
for
talking to
your
you.
time. And maybe we can do this again sometime soon. All right. Thank
That's
you.
good. All right, see.
Bye.
You.